everybody, welcome back for another astrology video. I'm doing it, it's in the afternoon. Usually I do my videos in the morning, and I'm in a bit of a different state of mind today. But I figured I'd go for it anyways because I have been writing in my journal about the transits, and I just have like an overabundance of ideas about this, and I made a video a while ago where I was kind of going just like full blast and talking about a lot of stuff, and even I just stopped because I got to about an hour, but I didn't even get through all my ideas, right? I just have an overabundance of stuff to talk about. And if you notice, I don't do any edits in these videos, and part of the reason is that I find that by cutting back on the kind of labor required for editing, or if I was going to put graphics or something like that, I can just instead focus that time on developing the ideas and also reading different books and developing it at a conceptual level, so I'm not so caught up on the production process, right? And but okay, one of the things coming into this video today, which is going to be the main thing I'm thinking about for this video, is Neptune stationing retrograde. It's not quite retrograde yet, but it's just approaching that station as the point of when I'm recording this video. I recently did a video on Saturn stationing retrograde, and of course, Saturn and Neptune are conjunct in Pisces, the last decan of Pisces. So the retrograde of Neptune has a lot to do with the retrograde of Saturn, which just recently happened as well. And in like the thing too is that I have been kind of a bit wishy-washy about whether or not to include current events and politics, and that part of that is because with everything going on in the world, with all the war, all the drama, I have been pretty open about, I'm a guy who, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of people who have mental health problems out there. A lot of, right? There's a lot of, I don't want to cause myself like undue stress by putting myself in the middle of a crossfire of some sort of violent political conflict, right? But nonetheless, there's something about the astrology, especially what just recently happened, where what's kind of on my mind about, you had Saturn stationing retrograde at the time when Joe Biden had this like really big blunder in his first debate with Trump, and that's just kind of like, there's something about that which just goes to show that, like, I'm approaching this channel from the position of, like, I don't know if I'm the kind of, if I have the personality that, like, if you imagine what your stereotype of people who are into astrology is like, I don't know if I have the personality that I'm, like, the kind of guy who makes astrology videos the same way other people do, or that I get along with other astrologers, or that I post, you know, if I want to post on all the different internet groups for astrology. But at the basic level, that I can see that astrology works, right? Astrology is real, astrology works, and when you see things happening in current events, it just kind of goes to show that you're like, okay, so the god Saturn, that has to do with old age, the god that has to do with things like declining health, and the things to do with obstacles or slowness or whatever, and you just and that this is going to be highlighted by Saturn stationing retrograde, and then you see that that's the, like, Joe Biden being like, Joe Biden looked like the old guy from 2001: A Space Odyssey, like, who's in his like deathbed staring at the monolith, being kind of like, it's sort of like, oh, like, I don't, this kind of absurdity of like that Trump is actually like, both these guys are like, what, in their 80s? Like, it's like we've got a bunch of geezers running for the president of the United States, and it's kind of a weird situation that goes with, and the fact that the highlight on old age and also around leadership and stuff like that happening at the time of Saturn stationing retrograde, I just thought it just goes to show you that it works, right? And at the same time now, we also have Neptune stationing retrograde in that conjunction with Saturn. And, it doesn't, I'm not really that, when it comes to the political thing, I'm not a Trump supporter. I'm not super keen about Biden. I'm a Canadian. I can't even vote in the American election. And Canadian politics is its own whole ball game. But the point is that Canada is a very small country which its economy is mainly just built off of selling stuff to the United States, right? Giving the United States energy and resources, and other than that, I mean, we just kind of like are piggyback onto the back of the United States, right? So, unfortunately, a lot of what happens in terms of Canada's economy has more to do with that than anything that we can have much direct control over, because we don't have a lot of political power, right? Now, there's some sort of issue around all this, with Neptune specifically stationing retrograde, that I wanted to get into. I got some notes here of like where I'm going with this. To shift gears a little bit from all the politics, right? I recently watched a documentary, and oftentimes when I do like videos on Neptune, one of the dynamics that I feel goes with Neptunes is cults, right? Because cults there's a certain people who have, it's like there's the difference between spiritual devotion and a kind of like deluded fantasy, right? Or the idea that cults often draw people in who have some sort of ideal kind of like fantasy about like the aliens are going to come down and save us, or we're all going to be transformed into like 5D light beings or something. Like people have some sort of like this kind of glowing ideal of what they're going to get from it, but then it ends up being kind of disappointing, right? Or there's a sort of like, that's with the Saturn, right? I think that there's some sort of thing going on with Neptune and Saturn where there's a sort of idealism or fantasy meeting like more of like the cold hard facts, or the hard material nature of reality, right? And I watched a documentary recently called Deprogrammed, which was interesting. And Deprogrammed was about this guy who was a cult deprogrammer who, some of the stuff he did was kind of like, it was weird because he would like kidnap people just like off the street and try to deprogram them. And there's certain questions, like he was very self-assured that what he was doing was right. But in some cases, maybe it wasn't so good what he was, but there's some people that thanked him and appreciated what he did, and other people who maybe didn't appreciate what he did, right? And it'd be too much to go into all the different cases, because there was quite a diversity, right, of different situations that he intervened in. But specifically what I thought was interesting was one of the cases in which the person not only was not grateful for the intervention, right, but the person stayed with their practice, stayed with their group, and it was not fazed by this person coming in and trying to correct their delusion, right? And this particular guy that I have in mind was a Hare Krishna guy, and one of the things to do with the Hare Krishnas was there's this whole thing about like selfless service, right? Or I think there's also with yoga, they talk about it in terms of like karma yoga. And oftentimes, sometimes when people have yoga studios, they'll do things like they're like internships where you like go in and you do work for them for free. And it's like, but in the sense that it's like karma yoga, you're doing free work, and by doing this kind of free work, you're paying off your karmic debt or something like that, right? But with the Hare Krishnas, I don't have a lot of experience with them, but I have some minimal contact. But I remember when I had this phase when I was living in Australia for a year, there were a couple restaurants in Melbourne that were run by the Hare Krishnas, and I don't know exactly what the arrangement is like, but there's this one that you were able to get a kind of a pretty, like a discounted lunch meal, and it was somehow like subsidized by some sort of arrangement that it was all the food was cooked by these Krishna people, right? So the Krishnas had this sort of like, I don't know a lot about it, but they had some sort of attitude of like surrendering the ego and going in and working the menial jobs, like working in a kitchen or cleaning or that kind of stuff. And this guy who's in the documentary was talking about how he would do these kinds of just like low-level cooking jobs, but he would feel such a kind of a bliss and contentment of just surrendering his ego, which was in, that thought, and I have to admit that personally I have never worked a cooking job, and that I'm not that great at cleaning. I don't know if that I'd probably be the best candidate to try to be a janitor, because it's kind of like would be going counter to this like fundamental messiness that I seem to have a problem with. But there's some like there's a meditation teacher that I was working with for years, and she was always trying to get me to be more like this, because she said that well, I don't know if I want. There's this kind of funny thing is that like I actually met her when I was a kid, although I don't know. Like I did this summer camp thing, and this meditation teacher was actually working at the summer camp, and she would just do menial jobs like cleaning the toilets at the summer camp and stuff like that, and with a similar attitude though of being like a meditator who was just surrendering to doing the lowest stuff, the little jobs, and just being blissed out despite the fact that there's not very glamorous work, right? And I think that's something that goes with Neptune together with Saturn, is that if I don't have it on the shelf here, but I have this Liz Greene book on Neptune, and Liz Greene, one chapter she talks about how Neptune relates to glamour, right? What we idealize or what we see as being a glamorous thing. However, when you combine that with Saturn, what you end up getting is a kind of an unglamorous thing, but there can be a kind of a sort of with the attitude of devotion or of surrender. Even the most unglamorous things become this sort of like there's this potential for a state of bliss and surrendering to the unglamorous side of life, right? Now, the thing is though, I mentioned this in the context of the cult documentary Deprogrammed, and the guy who was the cult deprogrammer was I don't know if I want to get into the race thing, but there's a factor that he was a black guy, and he was, and the Hare Krishna guy was a white guy, and there is maybe something different, like when you come from a privileged family, and then you idealize or you see some sort of glamour, or maybe it's not glamour, but it's like there's some sort of appeal to surrendering to some sort of low thing when people have expectations of you that you could do better, right? And there's something also if you're just doing like internship or like work for free or volunteer work or like karma yoga or something like that, that the deprogrammer guy was saying like, you're doing, you could do anything with your life. You've got your life ahead of you, and you are choosing to work the lowest possible job, just washing dishes and cooking food without even getting paid very well. And they're taking advantage of you. You have labor, you have a life potential, and you're just placing it. I mean, maybe you've deluded yourself into being blissed out doing this shitty work for no low pay, but you're in like I'm here to snap you out of this and say that there's more to life than this, right? That it's like a spiritual bypass. You could be doing so much more, and you're choosing this low level stuff, and you're gonna shave your head and be all blissed out about it. And I'm here to get you back to reality, right? And I think that's another side to the Saturn Neptune thing is like we gotta like throw the bucket of cold water on you to snap you out of this weird trance you're in, to shock you back into taking control over your life, right? And so this is the whole thing, is that like apparently this Krishna guy was like working at a restaurant, and there's something, I think because his family kind of had this attitude that he was just wasting his life because he'd been deluded by a cult. He had to do so much more. And there's like people, they had apparently the restaurant business was affected. Like people were protesting against the Hare Krishnas, or there's all this and it like just made a mess of their whole business and stuff. And this guy was just like kind of like, he had no intention to stop being Hare Krishna. But there's something in the plot line of this story. This guy eventually decided this whole message of that he was like selling himself short or whatever. He decided, instead of doing this like cooking and like this low level cooking stuff, being a kitchen worker and surrendering and all this stuff, that he would try to do his best. And he instead he went to med school, right? And he became a doctor. And then he started learning about different kinds of like holistic kind of things, so he could like and be, you know. And then so this guy is now this guy's still a Hare Krishna, but now he's a Hare Krishna medical doctor, and he's working at, you know, he's not just being like, I'm going to work for minimum wage doing a really low level thing. I'm going to actually try to apply myself and achieve something and do something good, right? And so, but it's a way that he took the criticism and was able to sort of integrate the message there and learn, but not give up his the thing that he was devoted to. And he was still kind of maybe annoyed, you know, he like, or the implication that he was all just deluded, or that he was completely off track with what he was doing. But he was still, it was in the circumstance. I thought it was interesting because he was able to integrate the opposition from and you know, Saturn of course rules the opposition, so there's a certain opposition or antagonism, but there's a way that I thought it was a cool story because the way this guy was able to kind of incorporate the lesson in a kind of dialectical synthesis, right? And now, okay, there's some other ideas that I had about this, that there's, of course, I had this polarity in my mind where on one hand you've got like this idea of like surrendering the ego to work really low level jobs, but like if you were if you were a white guy who could like go to med school and become a doctor, and it's like maybe actually a cop out to surrender your ego and work low level jobs when like what is asked of you is to become like an upstanding citizen member and contribute to society in maybe a more meaningful way or something like this. There's sort of like, whereas if there are, the problem with this whole thing is that if there are people who, by their circumstance, whether that's their identity politics or whatever, they are like, you are in a position where nobody expects anything, like nobody, there isn't on you this expectation that you're going to be a doctor or a scientist or make some sort of big contribution, and it's like you are kind of stuck doing the dirty work that nobody else wants to do, and you got some guy telling you that instead of trying to better yourself, you might as well just accept that you're not going to be anything better than a dishwasher your whole life, and you better just submit to that, or you'll be a lot happier if you just submit to that. You shouldn't try to resist it. You shouldn't try to improve things. Like, there's a certain bias in there, right? Especially if you are, if you are working really hard for low wages with a high cost of living, and meanwhile there's people who are rich elite people who are living the easy life, and you somehow have to just submit to your situation without any recourse to improving the structure of things, right? And this is, now I want to say that I don't really identify as being like a Marxist or a communist, but there is this whole thing about how I feel like what the Marxists and the communists were trying to do was a kind of a polar dynamic in the other direction, where it's like, rather than being all about a devotion to some sort of spiritual path and a surrender of the ego, there is instead the complete rejection of religion, which is why there tends to be this sort of conflict between the Marxist and the religious people. And instead, there is like, we're not going to like believe in any sort of transcendental reality where there's peace. Instead, we're going to focus entirely on the imminent circumstances and how do we actually improve life at that level. And the thing about thing about it's interesting is Liz Greene goes into this into her Neptune book as well. She talks about the Marxist Communist association with Neptune. It's like the idea is that there may be this kind of like accusation of the guy who is like surrendering to the low level dishwashing or whatever as being kind of deluded. There is a similar kind of delusion in thinking that you are going to create a kind of like utopian idealistic society by having some sort of revolution that's going to change everything. And I think it's pretty plainly obvious that it didn't really work out very well for the communists. And I mean, there could be there's a complicated conversation to have about exactly what went wrong and all this kind of stuff. But there's still an interesting, I think, polarity or dynamic that kind of is like a mirror image where there's this dream to basically create, rather than waiting for heaven as some thing that waits for us after death, we are trying to create heaven on earth by actually trying to make the material conditions better for everybody. But often that goes astray, right? That goes, and it gets all messed up, and the latent structures perpetuate themselves, and it's not a good time, right? However, there's something that goes out in there, there's I don't want to, it almost feels like bringing up Jordan Peterson is like bringing up Voldemort from Harry Potter, and like you don't even want to say his name, or like you start to, as soon as you say Jordan Peterson, it's like you hear the like the forces of the Peterson bros scuttling around. But there's this interesting thing that I notice, how like Jordan Peterson is like intensely anti-Marxist, anti-communist, and seems to he rose to fame basically in the midst of those tensions. But there's certain videos or interviews with him where he actually has a collection of communist propaganda, right? And there's some way in which his posters and things like that. And there's some way in which like his intense hatred of communism, or his intense opposition of it, is like this weird obsession that actually draws him to collect memorabilia and poster, and like probably more so than a lot of people who would identify as being more in favor of Marxism. Him as being a staunch opponent or starch, and he becomes so obsessed that it's like almost like he's like a collector of the thing that he hates, right? But there's something in the Jordan Peterson thing. I have to admit, I've never read any of his books. I have tried to watch some of his videos, but there's at some basic level, I'm not gonna get on board. Even if he says a few good things, I'm still like, there's something that is a bit energetically off with Peterson, even though I can see why he's popular, I guess, right? But what I find interesting is that, of course, his big book was the 12 Rules of Life, right? And there's this, I think there's a similar kind of thing, like the way that the communists the Marxists had the Communist Manifesto as like almost like a formula where like these are propositions about capitalism and the economy and politics, and just making an argument that if you follow this argument, this is what the end result is going to be, right? And there's some kind of there's something kind of, I agree in the sense that communism is kind of disturbing, especially when you look at old like Maoist kind of propaganda, or there's like some sort of like idealism that we can create this utopian society and it'll be like heaven on earth, and all the suffering will be solved because we worked it out. Like, we just worked out this formula of how to do it, and if you follow the formula, get the result, everything will be better, right? And I think the Neptune thing is like the tendency to project an ideal outcome, but being kind of deluded. And once you get there, you actually meet the reality, it's kind of like a sobering situation. And that's the Neptune-Saturn dynamic, right? But the Saturn dynamic, I feel that also has to go with this kind of thing about like rules, right? Or like structure and having, and I think that there's some sort of like inverse of the, like the whole, with the Peterson thing of like, you have these rules for life, you follow the rules for life, and there's a sort of like idealism of like projecting almost like a fantasy onto some what you're going to realize your wish fulfillment. You're going to create some sort of ideal image of the perfect life by living your life according to all the rules. And then, like, does anybody get there and actually feel satisfied? Or does anybody, is it something like some sort of path you're always walking, but you never get there, or something like that, right? There's like, to me, it seems like there's still the same danger of like you, rather than, I mean, you know, of like there's a certain side of uncertainty that you may have as an individual, and that by subscribing to a certain set of beliefs or rules or dogmas or whatever, or even different political positions, that there's this idea that like if we follow these things, then we will be led to the, you know, the glory land or whatever, like the better tomorrow, if we just take the steps that these people have laid out to us. And then at some point down the line, you're kind of like, wait a minute, this isn't quite as utopian as I was expecting it was going to be. And like, it's kind of like the cultist who starts to realize that maybe it's not all, you know, there may be reasons for suspicion, right? But there's some sort of, I think, kernel of truth in all this, that it's like I think at some level the intention of the rules that go with traditional religion is basically trying to create a formula that, like, if you follow these rules, you will have the most likely chance at being happy, being peaceful, having a good time in life. And I think there's a lot of stuff, like how they used to say, like, to avoid shellfish, that it's like, it's obviously maybe some of those rules, you know, like you can eat lobster and crab and it may not be so bad, but maybe, you know, a few thousand years ago they were having, you know, there's some reasons why you shouldn't eat shellfish, or there's reasons why, or no, you know, like why there's prohibitions around pork products, right? Like, is omitting pork from your life really going to be the big thing that's going to win you a spot in heaven? Or is that some sort of old-fashioned thing that is maybe not as relevant anymore? And I think that kind of has to do with the Saturn retrograde, the Neptune retrograde, these different rules, and like there may be some, you know, there may be some kind of you know, truth to it, but there may also be something which is kind of like a bit outdated or needs to be revised, or that this kind of idea that we kind of have to, like, I get the sense that there's something with Saturn standing for the old stuff, age, the Senex, the elder. There's something about how with the Saturn retrograde there's a revision, there's a review, there's this kind of like, what of this old stuff is worth keeping, and what of it do we need to like start fresh, right? Like we're always in the present moment, and we always have to live our life based on the reality we find ourselves in the present moment, and some other guy's rules that he came up with, and some other, you know, like maybe there's a more dynamic thing than just subscribing to something and like giving up your responsibility to make decisions yourself to some other person's rule book, right? And there's certain things that are like, you know, I tend to maybe think outside the box compared to other people, but maybe not. But like one of the things that I have often have an issue with is that, like, it's the summertime, it's the time when people's lawns go, you know, there's sometimes there's issues with droughts and stuff like that. But, you know, sometimes I'll be walking my dogs on a rainy day and people have their sprinklers on in the rain, right? And I think that kind of goes with the Saturn and Neptune dynamic with Pisces, like the sort of like water sign, and it's kind of like the Saturn being kind of like old and dumb and slow and just being like, it's like there's lots of water coming down from the sky. Why do you have your sprinkler on? Oh yeah, you just have an automatic sprinkler. Like it's some pattern set. Like you program this thing to just spray water, and now it's spraying water even when there is there's rain coming down from the sky. It's completely redundant. It's completely useless, and you're just wasting water for no reason, right? And then there's also this thing about how there are certain rules and regulations. Like there are rules that your grass has to be, if your grass is too high, you are violating the bylaws. So your grass is always going to have to be cut short. But when it comes to the use of energy and all this kind of stuff, did you know that in America that I think it's like the exact, it's either 1/4 or 1/3. I think it might be as high as 1/3. Apparently 1/3 of America's fresh water goes to watering lawns, right? So in this is all in the, like, I'm just kind of thinking about this too, is there's been Calgary just had this massive infrastructure problem where their main water main broke, right? And that they're I don't know what it would be like to live in Calgary for these past few weeks, because there's people are being asked not to shower. Like, I don't know where people are getting their drinking water from. There's this huge crisis where people are trying to fix their water, and then here in BC it's raining out when people just have their sprinklers on, right? It's like it's kind of silly, anyways, right? But where I was going with this, and we have bylaws where you have to cut our lawns, but apparently by letting your lawn grow long, it's actually more drought resistant, right? That the grass, that if you let your grass go tall and then go to seed, like those long full things of grass actually hold in water, and then during times when there's not as much rain, the grass doesn't go as brown as it does when it's cut short. Like the tall grass actually becomes drought resistant, and because it's more moist, it also is it's not going to be as likely to like catch fire or something, right? And there's also more like it's less of an ecological dead zone. There's more cover for animals and things like that. There are all these reasons why having shortly cut lawns are kind of like, it doesn't really from an ecological perspective doesn't make much sense. From an energy perspective, doesn't make much sense. Like, think about it. Like, how much, like, when gas is so hot, like, gas is expensive. Even, now we got electric lawnmowers, but you're going to be, like, going through all these lithium batteries just to mow the lawn, right? There's a great video. Maybe I'll put it in the comments. I found a great video a while back about a woman who was talking about alternatives to that kind of stuff. And she was talking about how, like, I don't know if this is true, like, whatever. I'm just going off of what I heard on YouTube, but apparently the whole idea of these lawns was started in the back in the day when you had a castle and you didn't want to have like a forest around your house, because like if you had people that were hostile, you wanted to be able to see them clearly, not give them a place to hide for cover so that you could shoot them with bows and arrows or muskets or whatever it would be, right? Like, so there's this kind of like, that's where the lawn comes from, right? The lawn is not really a friendly thing. It's like, if there are hostile forces approaching, then we have a clear line of sight to take them out, right? Like, that's the point of having a clear lawn, right? Whereas when you have sort of shade and foliage, you have a kind of a more privacy, and people, who knows what people might be getting up to when they have a bit of kind of lush plant cover or whatever, right? Whereas when you have a barren lawn, it's more of a kind of a battlefield situation where you're not giving your enemy a place to cover, so you can take them out at long range distance if necessary, right? So there's also this kind of like a basic element of like subjectification, right? There's a certain thing about like what I was saying about like the surrendering the ego and just being a servant you know, and the thing is, when you're doing that in the kitchen, it's like no matter what, people are going to need food, right? I mean, you can have your opinions about what kind of nutritional stuff is better or not, or you could be maybe make an argument for like veganism, right? Like you could be, I'm going to abstain from eating animals because to create a, and you know, there's a lot of the dynamic between the spirituality and the material. There are a lot of spiritual people. Even I have a few followers who are trying to convince me to become vegan, right? That there is a lot of people who see the abstinence of eating meat as a way that we can make the world a better place by reducing the suffering of all beings, by seeing the animals as fellow beings who not just there for us to eat, and that by not eating animals we are reducing suffering in the world and all that kind of stuff, right? And however, when it comes to be like surrender, like you could surrender your identification and be in service to the world, but I don't think that like if you're gonna do that and just like be a landscaper who like creates ecological dead zones, or like you're going to surrender to this structure where you waste 1/3 of your water supply and keeping your grass green, and you're not doing this for food. You're doing this so that you can keep up appearances with the neighbors or something like that. And it's like there's something about this which is like I don't necessarily think surrendering to that is a very good idea, or at least I am not, you know. But nonetheless, we have bylaws. You know, sometimes you don't agree with the bylaws, but you have to just do it anyways. But that's the there's a certain kind of pressure in the collective to conform to the rules or what standard of what is considered normal. But then when it starts to feel like these rules are kind of like how much of these rules are arbitrary, like don't eat pork or don't eat shellfish, and how much of these rules do actually have a bearing in making our life a better place, right? If we are having problems with droughts, if we're having problems with fires, if we're having problems with our water mains breaking and nobody can take a shower, then why don't we have more strict rules over not watering your lawns, and like people get all upset if you're not keeping your lawn up to a certain standard, right? Like, I don't know. I'm just using this as a fairly neutral example anyways, a fairly arbitrary example. But you could also apply the surrendering your own opinion, and I have to admit that I'm doing this about Neptune stationing retrograde, but there's also Mars conjunct Uranus in Taurus. At the time of making this video, the moon is in Taurus with this Mars-Uranus dynamic, and there's a certain... Okay, Uranus is in the third decan of Taurus in a sextile aspect to Neptune and Saturn. So there's this connection between Saturn and Neptune and Mars and Uranus. And I'm planning to do some more on Mars and Uranus, but for the sake of keeping my videos more specific I'm just talking about Neptune retrograde here. There's one other idea I had, and I think it kind of goes with Neptune relating to fantasy, right? And I have to admit, I mean, there's something about, there's a certain kind of spirituality where they talk about, like, spiritual awakening as all your fantasies are gone. All your imagination is gone. All you have is just reality, and you know all your illusions are burnt up or whatever, right? And there could be something with that Saturn Neptune that goes with this, like the sobering reminder or something like this, or the facing the facts, you know. But there's something about I have to admit that I kind of like keeping at least a little bit of fantasy, or keeping a little bit of imagination. Like, it seems to be the same kind of style of spirituality also wouldn't put a lot of importance on dreaming. Like, you know, you remember keeping a dream journal and you remember your dream. There's a certain type of spirituality that's like your dreams are just like, you know, your mind processing things from you're not going to find any deeper truth in that. It's just, you know, processing some images that you don't really have to worry about. That's not, and the images are all just sort of these phantasmic illusions anyways. There's no deeper meaning to any of it. Don't worry about it, right? Like I do like a little bit of the fantasy, a little bit of the imagination, a little bit of the paying attention to your dreams, but there is something I think about how there's Saturn and Neptune. I think it may go with this whole thing about, you know, how the culture, we as children, we are raised in a culture where, whether it's like I was a kid, I used to play Final Fantasy video games. I was that age that when Final Fantasy VII came out, I was like I was the demographic that it was marketed towards, right? Like the millennials who were coming of age and excited for a new generation of video game console. And prior to that, I played the Final Fantasy 3 and Chrono Trigger, or there's also, you know, Dungeons and Dragons, and then you know, you could also get into like, my sister was more into Harry Potter, although there's kind of like J.K. Rowling is not really it's a sensitive issue I don't want to get into, because there's a lot of people that were really into Harry Potter who have changed their mind after J.K. Rowling became a transphobe. And so there's certain things about, like, that's a bit getting off track of where, I mean, it does relate to the Jordan Peterson stuff that I was talking about, but I'm not going to get into that specific problem. But there's a certain issue around the, not just that, but like, you know, like I'm thinking like Halloween and, you know, all the different movies and media and all this. And it's like, there's a part of it that's fun, I think. I think there's some sort of fun quality to make believe and like play. And, you know, you're imagining something or you're writing a story. And it doesn't have to be, the whole idea of fiction is that you've got some room to play around with. You don't have to be like, everything has to be super factual or everything has to be super realistic. But there's some sort of like thing with Saturn and Neptune where I feel like there is the that contributes to the what I would call the fairyland quality of spirituality, or that we have some kind of like, we have all these images and associations that we've gotten from media that have given us, in the same way, okay, this relates to what I was saying earlier, in the same way that the communists, like to polarize this, the communists and the Marxists, this the same way that the communists and the Marxists and the revolutionaries had this expectation of a better world that they were going to create, and like Animal Farm, you know, like they ended up just perpetuating the same problems, right? But they had this dream. They had this dream of making a better world, and the dream turned out to be illusory, right? That I think in the same way that we have so much media, and this may even have, you know, you could also just forget the spiritual stuff. We could just talk about media in general. We could say that media in general has given us these expectations or these fantasies that we have, or these ideals, and that we think that, okay, well, I got to do this and that and the other thing, and to try to like create the life that I want. But like there's this, it gets into this point where like what you think you're doing by manifesting your desires, they're not really your desires, they're just a bunch of stuff that has been imprinted onto you because you've been watching too many movies and too many TVs, and you're just regurgitating something that's been fed to you, and you think that that's what you want, right? Or it could also be that you have some expectation for how your life is going to turn out, or if you're getting involved, you're going to go through some kind of like transformation or something and become some, like you're going to go be like the caterpillar that becomes a butterfly, and you have some expectation of what the butterfly life is going to be like, but that's all based on this stuff, this mass media culture. And there's something that's been coming up in my trying to work with this Neptune retrograde and the quality of fantasy and imagination, that I don't want to throw that out, throw the baby out with the bathwater and just advocate for a completely, burn away all your illusions and delusions and just have this crystal clear view of life, right? But you have to at least leave room for something to emerge which isn't based on your preconceived idea of what it's going to be. You have to have the ability to be surprised, or the ability for like the new revelation, or to be like, whoa, I wasn't expecting it was going to be like that. I wasn't like this. It turned out to be something that was different than all these images that I've been fed, or all these stories that I've been told, or that there's something that is like that defies the expectation that was being built up for me by other people who may have been misleading me, or may have been deluding me, or may have been like, maybe I had some hope or some dream that was leading me astray in some deluded direction. And there's something about this Neptune retrograde combined with the Saturn retrograde in Pisces. And Pisces, of course, too, is a very imaginative, fantastical kind of sign. That there's something about grounding that back in reality that could be disappointing, could be like the sobering reminder, but it could also be like interesting in the sense that it defies expectations, right? Like it comes out in a way that you're like, it wasn't what you were expecting, right? It wasn't what you thought it was going to be like, right? And that the fact that, and maybe that can be disappointing, but maybe that can be part of what makes life interesting, right? Is that life has some kind of quality, like the slippery fish of Pisces, when you try to have some sort of idea of what you want and you're grasping onto it, that it's just going to slip away from you. But there might be something that turns out to be different than what you're expecting, or different than the story they were telling you, the sales pitch that the salesman was giving you. Rather than feeling ripped off, you can be like, oh, this turned out, this wasn't quite what I was after, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, right? Right? So that is part of my idea for this Neptune retrograde. Thanks for watching. Tune in for more. I've got more. I got a notebook full of ideas that I'm just cooking up. I'm scribbling away, writing down stuff, working out ideas, and I've just got. Well, I don't want to oversell it, but I've got. I don't want to get your expectations too high for what's coming, but I've got plenty of stuff that I'm working on. Thank you for watching. Okay.